It's time to tune in to Defending the Faith with Frank Harber. Hear the latest about religious liberty.
A win for religious freedom in one of the remaining blockbuster cases facing the U.S. Supreme Court this term.
A legal battle continues for the Little Sisters of the Poor for nearly a decade now.
A street preacher armed with a speaker, a microphone, and a camera strapped to his chest is now banned from the village.
Our founding fathers believed in the separation of church and state, but not for one fleeting moment did they believe in the separation of God and government.
And powerful apologetics. Are you prepared to defend the faith?
I'm convinced unless we trust in God, this nation is finished.
We're facing a new kind of enemy. We're involved in a new kind of warfare, and we need the help of the Spirit of God.
3, 2, 1.
Welcome to another episode of Defending the Faith. I am your host, Frank Harber, and I am the President and Chief Legal Counsel for the Institute for Christian Defense. We defend the faith. You can find us online at defendingthefaith.law. We do several things. We defend religious liberty in the legal arena. We do court cases. We defend churches, pastors, Christian businessmen. We got a big case right now that's going on in Kentucky. We help defend denominations, some children's homes. We also help churches with their bylaws and different things, protecting them to make sure that they're insulated from lawsuits and things like that. We also defend the faith by creating resources. I've got several books that I've written on why Christianity is true, how to know God exists. Our newest book, which you can get for free, it's an ebook, Objection Overruled, how to respond to the top 10 objections to Christianity. You can find that online at defendingthefaith.law. In essence, what we do is we talk about all things concerning Jesus, because Jesus is the truth. He is the name which is above all names. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so our ministry and our legal practice, all of it is just all about Jesus. And I'm excited about today's show because the person that we have on our show is all about Jesus. He's written a book about Jesus that's just come out. It's a wonderful book. It's a new book, but his name is Dr. Andrew Hébert. Now, I got to tell you, this is a great story because I wasn't sure how to pronounce his name. So I did an investigation before the show. So I called a friend of mine, Dr. Gil Lane, who was once the senior pastor of the great Paramount Baptist Church in Amarillo, Texas. And now he is the pastor emeritus of that church. And he now lives in Tyler, Texas, pastors a church called Bethel. And so I called Dr. Lane and I said, can you tell me how to pronounce Dr. Andrew's name? I said, I don't want to mess up because, I've come out with, like about 7 different ways that I can say this name because there's a mark in front of the E. So just to give you a clue, his last name is spelled H-E with some kind of breathing mark above it, B-E-R-T. And so Dr. Lane said, just pronounce his name like this, a bear, like you saw a bear in the woods. And so now we have actually got the actual real live Dr. A. Bear on this program. He is a gifted communicator, gifted pastor. He has 2 degrees from Criswell College, where I used to teach as an adjunct professor. He's got a bachelor's and a master's there, but that wasn't enough. He went to the Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, where I taught as a guest professor, a visiting professor in 1998. That was probably before Dr. Hébert was born. But then he got another master's there. I don't know why he needs 2 masters, but this guy has more degrees than a thermometer. Then he also has a Ph.D. This guy is really, really smart. He has written a brand new book called Shepherding Like Jesus. That's what we're going to talk about today. He is the senior pastor of the Paramount Baptist Church in Amarillo, Texas. Dr. Hébert, welcome to Defending the Faith.
Dr. Harber, it is such a joy to be with you, and I want to congratulate you on correctly pronouncing my last name. You nailed it, and I really appreciate you and your ministry and the great work that you are doing defending religious liberty. Such a huge need in these days.
Thank you. Okay, so tell us, before we get started, so tell us about this church that you pastor. You are in this town. It feels like a foreign country because I'm in Dallas, Texas, but you're in this place so far away, we can't see it from here. It's called Amarillo, Texas. So tell us about where you're at there. Tell us about this church.
Yeah, we're in the Texas Panhandle, Amarillo, Texas. We're about 6 hours away from you there in Dallas. In fact, we can be in 4 state capitals faster than we can be in our own state capital in Austin. So we are really out here, and I pastor Paramount Baptist Church. You referenced Gil Lane. Gil was the pastor here for about 24 years. His predecessor was the pastor here for about 22 years, and his predecessor was the founding pastor. So in the church's 62, 63-year history, I'm only the 4th pastor.
That's
incredible.
Been here
for about 5.5 years, and wonderful congregation, wonderful community in God's country, Big Sky country here in West Texas.
You know, when I was a kid, I wrestled. And so we had the state championship at the Amarillo Convention Center. And so we go out there in a big bus. And the first night we're there, they took us to a steakhouse. And I think it was called the Big Tex Steakhouse. And they had some kind of steak that if you ate the whole, I think it was 72 ounces. If you ate the whole thing, that you would get it for free. And I've got my 2 boys. They produced the show, and you met them just a second ago, Hunter and Graham. And I told them, I said, one of these days we're going to go to Amarillo, Texas, and we're going to try to do the steak challenge. Have you done that steak challenge?
I've seen the steak challenge done, but I've never done it myself. The Big Texan is still here, 72-ounce steak and all the fixins. So you have to have a salad and a drink and a roll and a baked potato and the whole thing. And usually it's about these 90-pound women who can do it. These big football players will come in and they'll try and fail, but you'll get these small women who will come in and they'll knock it down in about 15 minutes. Okay,
well, I can see my real skinny boys over here reacting to this to the side, and they're praying about it over here. So you got a new book that has just come out. Tell us about this book and what led you to write this book.
Yeah, the book's called Shepherding Like Jesus, Returning to the Wild Idea That Character Matters in Ministry. So the subtitle kind of gives it away. It's on the importance of character, integrity, virtue in ministry leadership. And I call it the wild idea because it's something that it's kind of fallen out of vogue. I mean, it's not that any of us would deny that character matters in ministry. It's just that we have emphasized so many other things in terms of what we're looking for from leaders, from Christian leaders, particularly from Christian pastors. And so this book is really a return to something old, to something biblical, to something that is true and right and good. And that is to say that the most important aspect of your leadership is not primarily your competence. It's not primarily your charisma, your leadership capacity, but the most essential aspect of your leadership is your character. And so I do that by taking Jesus's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. And the book is really an application of the Sermon on the Mount, particularly the Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount, which is the introduction to the sermon. And it's an application of that sermon to pastoral life and pastoral work. So it's a book primarily written to pastors, but there's a lot of application to Christian leaders in general. And I think even any believer can benefit from this book.
This is a phenomenal book. And I'm looking at, some of the names of some of the people who wrote at some of the end of the chapters on this book. Doug Munton, we went to Southwestern together, Michael Catt, Mac Brunson, and then you got Dr. Nathan Lorick, who I'm just crazy about this guy. He's our new executive director for the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention, and this guy's the real deal. I mean, you've got some really great people that have contributed to this book. It's amazing. How'd you get all those guys?
Well, a lot of them are friends. And so I thought the book would be strengthened by inviting some wise, godly, seasoned leaders, well-respected men who've led in this model, who've really modeled character and ministry for a long time. And so, at the end of every chapter, basically the way the book is structured, every chapter is an application of a different beatitude. So, your listeners are probably familiar with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the humble, and so forth. So each beatitude forms the topic of a chapter. And at the end of every chapter, I've invited one of these wise, seasoned pastors kind of to the conversation table to reflect on the theme of each of those chapters. And I think it really strengthens the book.
Oh, it's excellent. And the first chapter starts out bad attitudes. So how's that go?
Yeah. So my point there is that, we can talk about the Beatitudes, but we need to realize that sometimes there are some pastoral bad attitudes. And then I just start the chapter by saying, that pastors are people too. We are broken. We are sinful. And I think it's a mistake actually to think that we are above our people or somehow more godly than our people. We're people. The shepherd of the flock, the fact is I'm a sheep as well. And sometimes there are some bad attitudes, some sinful attitudes that can seep into the life of a pastor. And so I talk about 5, kind of common pitfalls that pastors can fall into. There's the pitfall of fame. When you're in ministry for renown, for your name being known, that's a pastoral bad attitude. It's a pitfall. The pastoral pitfall of infidelity. Being unfaithful to our spouse, whether it's adultery or pornography or something like that, that's a huge pitfall in ministry. Finances, that can be a pitfall when we're greedy, when we're in it for the money, when we mishandle our finances, that can be a pitfall. Fighting is another pastoral pitfall. There are always conflicts in church. Sadly, sad to say, there are times when, the church is known not by its peaceable, unified attitude, but by its fighting and its division. And sometimes pastors can step into the middle of that and become a bully, become divisive, become toxic in their leadership. That's a pitfall. And then finally, the final pitfall I talk about there is the pitfall of fatigue. And that leads to ministry burnout. It's when work becomes a mistress, when you commit a kind of adultery, but the mistress is your work, and the church becomes you really sacrifice your family on the altar of the church, and you work and work and work, but then you burn out, and that actually is a kind of a gateway drug to a lot of these other pitfalls as well. When you get so tired, your defenses come down, and then you can give way to some of these other bad attitudes. So those are just some things that kind of are common pitfalls that you see out there in ministry, guys who have moral failings or public falls from ministry due to toxic leadership. A lot of times it's because of one of those 5 bad attitudes.
Interesting. And, I love the chapter on spiritually impoverished. And that's the one that Dr. Lorick appears in. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that was pretty relevant.
Yeah. So the first beatitude in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, you will be blessed, that you are blessed when you are poor in spirit. And so what does it mean to be poor in spirit? Well, it doesn't mean to sort of, it doesn't mean financial poverty. It doesn't mean to sort of have a mopey, depressed attitude. You're kind of downcast in spirit. D.A. Carson says that to be poor in spirit means to recognize your own spiritual bankruptcy. That is, that you don't have the spiritual resources that you need. Jesus calls us in the Sermon on the Mount to live a life of righteousness. In fact, he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you won't enter the kingdom. But the sermon begins with a recognition that I don't have that kind of righteousness. My spiritual bank account is absolutely empty. And therefore, if I want to live the kind of righteous life that God has called me to live, it begins with that recognition. I don't have what it takes. I don't have those spiritual self-resources. If I want to live the kind of righteous life that God calls me to live, Jesus has to give me his own righteousness, which is the good news of the gospel, right? Mm-hmm. I don't have what it takes, but Jesus does. And he can fill me with his very own righteousness. He can make me righteous. He can declare me righteous if I will simply ask him for it. And so everything in the Christian life begins with that recognition. I don't have what it takes, but he does, and so I'm going to ask him for it. And just as true as that is in the life of a believer, it's also true in the life of a pastor. You will set your feet on a healthier pastoral pathway when you realize that despite your natural or cultivated giftedness, despite your ability to preach great sermons or lead a staff or grow the church, really you will have a healthier ministry when you realize that without Jesus you can do nothing, that you are spiritually bankrupt without him. You don't have enough spiritual resources for your own justification, for your sanctification, for your glorification. You don't have the spiritual resources for your ministry. And a healthy ministry begins when you get off of the throne, realize that you don't have what it takes, and you start running to Jesus and begging him to give you what you need in your ministry.
Oh, that's so good. You've got to also have a great section that I think everybody needs to read on brokenness. And, I've pastored 2 churches. I pastored one not broken, and the second one that I pastor now, I'm broken. And, I wish this guy right here, you could put me back in a time machine because it just changes everything. Would you talk about broken?
Yeah, my chapter on broken, really what I'm talking about there is the second beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn. And what does it mean to mourn? Well, it means to be broken over your sin. And it's really, Frank, it's the logical next step in the Beatitudes. There's a logical connection between all 8 of the Beatitudes. When you come to the recognition of your own spiritual bankruptcy, that you don't have what it takes, then what that leads to is a sense of mourning and brokenness over our sin. And what I write about there is, we have a lot of pastors, and I've been there myself as well, where we're gifted, we're capable, and we're known more by our boldness and our bragging than our brokenness. And so you've seen this. You've gone to conferences where you'll see other preachers, and it's you talk to each other in the hallway, and it's like, how are things going? And you kind of humble brag, like you're reading the back of a baseball card about your church's stats. Here, it's the B's, the buildings, the budgets, and the butts and the seats. We just built the new building, or our budget is this, or here's how many people are coming to our church. And it's braggadocious. We're known for that. Sadly, as pastors, we're known for being bold in the pulpit, being bold in the truth, being bold in our leadership. But Jesus doesn't say, blessed are the bold. He doesn't say, blessed are the bragging. He said, you're blessed when after you've come to a recognition that you don't have what it takes spiritually, that leads you to a brokenness, which, by the way, then leads you to the next beatitude, blessed are the humble. Instead of the prideful, instead of saying, I've got what it takes, I can do this, it leads you to a place of humility where you realize you've got to look to Jesus to provide what you need.
And, humility is a incredible place to be because it leads to a destination. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and something happens. Can you talk about this one right here, the humble?
Yeah. So humility, obviously the opposite of hubris, the opposite of pride. C.S. Lewis says that humility is not thinking less of yourself; it's just thinking of yourself less. And again, it's the logical outflow of brokenness. When you mourn over your sin, when you really see yourself for as sinful and needy as you are, instead of thinking great things about yourself, putting yourself in that place of pride, it leads you to a lowliness, to a humility, and it leads you to the next beatitude, which is where Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now, see, when I'm humbled because of my brokenness over my spiritual poverty, now I'm hungry for what I don't have. So often in our lives, you've seen probably the T-shirts or the memes out there on Facebook that says, you are enough. Have you seen those?
Yeah.
You are enough. That's like the opposite of the gospel. The gospel says, you aren't enough. You don't have what it takes. And that ought to humble you so that you then become hungry for Jesus to give you what you don't have, for Jesus to fill you with his righteousness. And so humility then leads you to be hungry for Jesus to fill up what lacks in your spiritual bank account.
I love how this book, and by the way, if you're listening, we're going to tell you how you can get this book at the end. So you really should get it. But this book builds on things. And I know that, at a point in my life where as a pastor, I was missing some of these things, humility and stuff, and I was broken. I started experiencing things that I really hadn't before, which is the next one, compassion, which, some of these things build on each other. And, after being broken, now I see people at church different than I ever did before. I can spot hurting people. That was something that I was kind of blind to before. Can you talk about this next one, the sympathetic pastor? Because we might be missing this.
Yeah. So let's zoom out a little bit here and let's think about the Beatitudes and kind of how the flow of Jesus' teaching is working here. So the path of blessing begins when you recognize you don't have what it takes, your own spiritual bankruptcy, which then leads you to be broken over your sin. You are mourning over that, which then leads you to a place of humility where you are now ready to ask God to fill you with his righteousness, to begin to do in your life what you need, give you what you don't have, but that you must have if you want to enter the kingdom. And there's a great promise there. When you're hungry and thirsty for righteousness, you will be filled. In other words, this is something God does in you. It's not something you don't fill yourself with righteousness. Jesus begins to form his righteous life in you. That's the first 4 Beatitudes. Now, when you begin to hunger and thirst for the kind of righteousness that only Jesus can produce in your life, it changes you. And that's, if you want to know what the changed righteous life looks like, look at the last 4 Beatitudes. So the last 4 Beatitudes really describe the result of what happens when you hunger and thirst for the righteousness of Jesus and he begins to fill you with that righteousness. And the first thing that Jesus says is that you will be a person of mercy. You will become a merciful person. And think about that. When if I was not spiritually impoverished, if I was spiritually wealthy and I had, I was righteous, then I could look at other people who are unrighteous and I'd be a judgmental jerk. Why can't you be righteous like me? But when I instead recognize, I don't have what it takes either. I am spiritually bankrupt and I'm broken and I mourn over my own sin. That actually produces in me a heart of sympathy toward fellow sinners. It's a recognition that I am as sinful as the people I lead. And because I've experienced the mercy of Jesus in my life, I can now extend the mercy of Jesus to other people's lives. John Claypool, you probably recognize that name, who was a great Baptist preacher from yesteryear. He said that, one of the great gifts that a pastor can give to his people is the gift of, first of all, being wounded, and then sharing our woundedness to help heal the woundedness of others. And so a good pastor, a shepherd like Jesus, is someone who looks around at the sheep who are hurting and broken, and we can extend mercy and sympathy and compassion to them because we realize we are just as broken. We need Jesus just as much. And whatever your sin is, I can look in the mirror and say, you know what? I'm the chief of sinners. And so I'm not going to be judgmental and harsh in my ministry. I'm not going to be toxic in my ministry towards you. Instead, I'm going to be gentle. I'm going to be compassionate. I'm going to be sympathetic with you in your weakness, and I'm going to be able to minister to you out of my own woundedness. And that's really a reflection of Jesus' own character, right? Jesus, who was gentle and lowly in heart, who invited us to come into his presence to find rest for our weary souls. That's a compassionate Savior, right? Think about what Hebrews says about Jesus, who is a sympathetic high priest. That really models for us what our pastoral ministry should look like.
And then you talk about purity, blessed are the pure. I mean, if we're impure, how can we be pure?
Yeah. So I think we're now on Beatitude number 6. Blessed are the pure in heart. So again, we're talking about what does it look like to live this righteous life? Well, Jesus says you're blessed when you're pure in heart. Well, first of all, it starts with this recognition that I'm not pure. And in fact, I cannot be pure without Christ. But if I will repent of my sin and turn in faith toward Christ and his finished work through his death on the cross, his burial, and his resurrection from the dead, that there is a miracle that can happen, that God can make me pure. And now that happens in a couple of different ways. First of all, is what I would call positional righteousness. When you turn your life over to the Lord, you are declared righteous. You are declared pure. When you become a Christian, you're a follower of Jesus. God looks at you no longer in your sin, but in the righteousness of Christ. Now, the reality is, I mean, Frank, you've seen enough people who, maybe God saves them out of a background of drugs and alcohol and, maybe a really rough road. That transformation doesn't happen overnight all the time. Sometimes those weeds of sin have wrapped around the heart, and it takes a while to kind of pull the weeds up out of this garden that God's working with called the human heart. And so there is not just a positional aspect to our righteousness, but there's also a progressive aspect. We call this sanctification. So to use the theological terms here for a minute, the Bible talks about justification and sanctification. Justification means that when you become a follower of Jesus, you are declared righteous. Positionally before God, you are pure. But then the Holy Spirit begins to work in your life in a progressive way. That's called sanctification, where God actually begins to shape your life to look more and more like Jesus. And so now I'm not just positionally pure, but now I'm becoming progressively actually pure in heart. That means not just my actions become pure, but my motivations become pure. God literally begins to change the affections and the loves of my life, the loves of my heart, to reflect the purity of Christ. That doesn't all happen all at once. It won't ever happen perfectly until glorification, right? When we see Jesus and we're perfectly pure. So we're positionally pure today. We're progressively being made pure. One day we will be perfectly pure in the presence of God. That's something that we look forward to. But our calling in the here and the now is to be submitting our lives to the work of the Spirit so that he can purify our motives and our actions. And that's true in the life of a believer. It's also true in the life of a pastor. We want pure pastors. We want pastors that value personal purity. We've all seen stories about pastors who've had these kind of public moral failings. They've committed adultery or this, that, and the other. They're not pure. And if we want to lead like Jesus, if we want to, be pastors of character, it means that we have to value holiness. We have to value purity in our relationship with people of the opposite sex, in our relationship with money, in our motivations for why we do ministry. And we, as pastors who shepherd like Jesus, we need to be submitting ourselves to the work of the Spirit to purify those things in our lives.
And then out of this purity, you talk about, how we're, as shepherds, we're supposed to bring healing to a hurting congregation. Can you talk about that next phase?
Yeah, so this is Beatitude number 7, where Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. Mm-hmm. And as you look at the pastoral landscape, you see some different kinds of pastors. You see some pastors who maybe are more comfortable in a boxing ring than anything else. They just like to fight. They don't like to make peace. They are divisive. They are toxic. They are bullies. They're fighters. And there are times, certainly, where we need to be willing to fight, certainly for the truth of the gospel, for doctrinal, fighting against doctrinal error or doctrinal impurity. We need to be willing to take a stand. You do that, right? In a courtroom, mm-hmm. You do that in the public square. And there are moments where we need to be willing to fight for what's right. But we should never be eager for a fight. Mm-hmm. And how we fight matters. Paul talks about the qualifications of an elder when he writes to Timothy. And he says that pastors are to be gentle. We're not to be bullies. So sometimes we see pastors out there who are real bullies and their leadership is toxic. The other kind of pastor that we see out there are pastors who, so on the one hand, there's sort of pastors who are eager to fight, and then there are pastors who are unwilling to fight ever. And they sort of misread the sermon. They say, blessed are the peacekeepers. And they would rather just not deal with conflict, just kind of keep the peace. If there's an issue in the church, just kind of stick your head in the sand, hope it'll go away. Jesus, though, teaches us to be peacemakers. And that means that we are those who can come and bring healing, bring reconciliation to relationships, pastors who can lead through the process of forgiveness and reconciliation. And this is what I call in the book, the pastor's priestly ministry. We can sometimes think about the pastor's prophetic ministry. The pastor is prophet, the one who comes and sort of declares the truth of God, and preaches and then leaves. But a pastor is also like a priest. If you think about the priests in the Old Testament, they had a ministry of reconciliation. Of course, this is what Jesus says that we have as believers as well, a ministry of reconciliation. We ought to be leading in that way as pastors. Instead of being pastors who are unwilling to fight or eager to fight, we ought to be pastors who are willing to fight for peace, willing to fight to bring healing to hurting congregations, willing to fight for forgiveness and for reconciliation. By the way, Jesus says, when you are a peacemaker, you will be called a son of God. And I think that the reason that you're called that is because when you make peace, you're actually doing what the Son of God came to do. If you read the book of Ephesians chapter 2, this is what Jesus came to do, to tear down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile, to make peace, not just vertically, reconciling humans to God, but also horizontally, reconciling us to one another. And we ought to lead in that way as pastors.
Now, you talk about the enduring pastor, and I think and the little subtitle of this chapter is How to Withstand Criticism. Now, this might be the price of admission for this book for pastors that are listening. We have about 2,500 subscribers and a lot of pastors, and I want you to talk about this one. Because this is an issue.
No, it is the issue. In fact, I think criticism is maybe one of the hardest parts of being in ministry. It is hard to endure. It's hard to withstand. But Jesus says, as you're living this life of righteousness that God begins to produce in you, the last beatitude is that you are blessed when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. And he says you're blessed, and there's a great reward. He promises a great reward if you're willing to endure through that persecution. In other words, when you love Jesus so much, when he's produced and shaped and formed his righteousness in you to the point that you are willing to endure anything for his name's sake, he says there is a great reward for you. What a promise. And he says you're actually like the prophets who came before you when you undergo this kind of persecution. So I talk here in this chapter about the importance of endurance in ministry. And yeah, the reality is if you're in ministry for more than about 5 minutes, you are going to undergo criticism. From the moment you first begin to speak in the pulpit, there are going to be people who just decide they don't like you. And maybe there's no justifiable reason for that. They just don't like the way you're dressed, or they don't like the sound of your voice, or they don't like what you're doing. But you're going to begin to experience criticism. And what I've found over the years is that this is one of the most difficult aspects of ministry is because most pastors are people. We like people. We want to be liked by people. And when people don't like us and we begin to experience harsh criticism, maybe unfair criticism, it makes us want to quit. And, the last couple of years with COVID-19, I've been a pastor for 17 years. The last 2 years have been the most difficult of my ministry. I mean, you can't make a good decision. You can't make a decision that will please everybody. And it seems like some of the criticism has been put in the harshest of terms. I remember when we had to shut down for 12 weeks, I got a handwritten 7-page letter. I received it on Good Friday. I'm about to walk into the studio to record our Good Friday service. And that letter called me a lackey of Satan for closing the doors of the church. 3 months later, we reopened, and I got an email from a deacon who said, there are going to be people in this community who die because you are asking people to come back into the building. So, you're condemned if you do it. You're condemned if you don't. All of this criticism. And Jesus says, expect it. If you're a pastor, if you're a leader, or if you're just a believer, you can expect to be persecuted, to be attacked, to undergo criticism, but you are blessed when your commitment to Jesus is such that you are willing to endure it. And so the chapter is really about how to endure it. I talk about the fact that pastors need to have the hide of a rhinoceros and the heart of a golden retriever. We need to have tough hides tender hearts. We don't want to be tough. We want to be tough when we're receiving criticism, but we don't want to be cynical or tough towards people. We want to maintain a tender heart towards people. And we have to have, what I call gospel grit, just the ability to take a punch, to endure it, to be like the prophets who came before us, who were wrongly attacked and criticized, and to keep on keeping on for his name's sake. And so I write about how to do that and some things I hope will encourage and help pastors to endure and withstand in ministry.
I hope that everybody who's listening will want to get a copy of this book, especially, most of our subscribers are pastors, but those that aren't have a pastor, and I hope you'll get this book for your pastor. Now, let's talk about the end of this book, which is the blessed pastor. Is that possible?
Yeah. So, here I'm just coming back to the repetition of the word blessed.
Yes.
Jesus says, you are blessed, you are blessed, you are blessed, you are blessed when. And so I just write here about, the blessing of ministry. It's a mixed blessing. Sometimes it's a burden and a blessing. I love the quote that I put in that chapter where the author of Amazing Grace, John Newton, he wrote another poem in which he says that ministry is a bittersweet, a sorrow full of joy. Boy, that really captures the dynamics of ministry. It's bitter and it's sweet. It's sorrowful. It's full of joy. It is a burden. It is a blessing. So I talked about kind of the mixed blessing there, but that is what Jesus promises. He promises that if you live this life in the kingdom, and particularly he's writing to Christian leaders, the 12, he's speaking to the 12 disciples there in the Sermon on the Mount. If you will lead in these kinds of ways, Jesus promises you will be blessed. Ministry is worth it. And I would just say, if I could speak to a pastor who may be listening, who is thinking about quitting today, let me just encourage you, keep your hand to the plow. You are not alone. We're in this together. The things you're experiencing, the heartache and the trouble that you're going through, I'm going through. And every pastor I know is going through, but it is worth it. Jesus talks about a reward in heaven. Peter talks about in 1 Peter chapter 5 that there is a crown that is waiting for the shepherds who shepherd well. And so let me just encourage you, see the goal. Look to Jesus, the author and finisher of your faith. Run the race with endurance. As my friend Jimmy Draper, who contributed to the book, as he says, don't quit before you finish. Don't fizzle before the finish line. Keep running. The reward from the chief shepherd is worth it.
You have been listening to Dr. Andrew Hébert, senior pastor of Paramount Baptist Church in Amarillo, Texas. Now, this book is special. If you've listened this far, you know this. You should definitely get a copy of this book for your pastor. It's interesting because in the front of the book, he talks about he's not going to get any money from this book. All the money from this book is going to missions. So we're not asking you to get this book to, help Andrew, but getting this book because it's a difference-making book. It's an awesome book. Andrew, tell us, how do we get a copy of this book? How do we find you? Give us all your details and information. I know some people probably want to keep up with you and maybe even hear some more of your preaching and teaching.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, you can find the book at really anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, that kind of thing. There's a website for the book that has a few resources about the Sermon on the Mount that I've included there and so forth. It's just shepherdinglikejesus.com. Shepherdinglikejesus.com. It'll take you to everything you need to know in terms of how to find the book. And then if anybody would like to follow me, I'm on social media. My handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are at Andrew Hébert 86, and I'd love to connect with you there.
Awesome. Well, it has been a joy to have you on the show. I want to thank everybody for listening. Remember, you can find out anything that you need to know about our ministry, the Institute for Christian Defense, at defendingthefaith.law. We pray that you have been blessed, and we will see you in the next episode.